But today we found out it gets far worse. But first, it wouldn't be the media show without us shining a light on yet another unhinged power grab by Labor's Communication Minister, Michelle Rowland. Now, you'd be aware by now of Labor's bid to control digital discourse through the very ominous-sounding misinformation bill.
3호 2호기 위성 발사 성공. 12월 10일 평안북도 철산군 서해 위성 발사장에서 운반 로켓 은하 3을 통한 광명성 3호 2호기 위성의 발사가 성공했습니다. 위성은 예정된 궤도에 진입했습니다.
Okay. Thank you.
We've reported on this extensively because the bill seeks to create a legal framework which encourages the use of fact-checkers and other partisan operatives to censor the debate. But there was always a caveat that restricted how harmful the bill could be. It was never clear whether the government of the day itself could wield these powers and control the debate. It had been assumed that there would be a degree of independence in the decision-making behind what constitutes misinformation. Now, that alone has triggered warnings from constitutional law experts such as Anne Toomey, who told The Australian in September the bill could seriously undermine freedom of speech, which is a major pillar of our democracy.
Your question is an absurd one.
But today we found out it gets far worse. The Australian has uncovered a secret letter Minister Rowland wrote to Anthony Albanese informing him that her bill should grant her powers.
You can only become invisible when absolutely nobody is watching you.
To steer investigators into whatever matters she thinks are misinformation. Communications Minister Michelle Rowland says she will have the power to lie! She will have the power to direct the media watchdog to investigate instances of online misinformation. Under controversial proposed laws to toughen regulations for digital platforms that have raised free speech concerns, the Australian reports. Now, the coalition is understandably upset about this because there has been absolutely no public commentary that this power would exist, and it hasn't featured as part of the debate. Now, Labor has a terrible track record for authoritarian overreach.
That's my style. I hope you've noticed that.
And you cannot trust a government to determine what is true and what is false. Just last week, we saw the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, who is the top law officer in the nation, who went on this deranged spray because he did not like the questions.
I will not be apologising for pursuing the rule of law, and I will not be apologising for acting. Do not interrupt. I will not be apologising for acting. I will not be apologising for acting in accordance with a High Court decision. Your question is an absurd one.
Well, Dreyfus later apologised for that appalling conduct.
I will not be apologising.
But he did not do so publicly. Labor released dozens and dozens of hardened criminals into the community with no special contingencies for integration, and Australians were allegedly indecently assaulted and robbed as a result.
I do need you to understand that
This is standard procedures.
But when Labor is pressed on the shocking failures like that, the party screams misinformation or attempts to discredit the journalist with ad hominem attacks, just like our Attorney General did.
Do not interrupt.
These people have no integrity or right to become the arbiters of truth. Many of these people have never even held real jobs outside of politics and have the cognitive reasoning skills of a toddler. We are at a crossroads right now. There must be a separation between your freedom to think and a government's interpretation of what constitutes responsible speech. Frankly, it's none of their damn business what any of you say and what any of you think. And even if you are the most ardent Labor supporter and don't believe the party would ever misuse these powers, what happens when another party wins the federal election?
Your question is an absurd one.
What happens when all of a sudden someone who thinks differently to you wields these powers?
Your question is an absurd one.
Well, let's bring in our panel to discuss. We've got broadcaster Kel Richards in the studio and Sophie Ellsworth, media writer at The Australian. Kel, let's start with you. Thanks for joining me on the desk. Final show of the year, so I'm pleased to have you.
Big things to talk about.
A lot to talk about, but let's start with this misinformation bill and these secretive powers that Labor just wasn't going to tell us about them, I guess, until it was legislated.
Well, they were never going to tell us about it. Can I say...
I didn't think it was appropriate.
The thing that's disturbing me is where the burden of proof lies. Classically, under criminal law and anything that comes under common law, the burden of proof is on the person making the accusation. And I am innocent until proven guilty. That's the foundation of our legal system. But in the regulations that have come in the last few decades, they've reversed that. Under a lot of human rights regulations, you have to prove your innocence. Your innocence is not assumed. Now, I'd like to know, under this Misinformation Act, whether the burden of proof rests with the minister, and if the minister's going to say, you should investigate this person, here is the evidence, or is it up to me then to say, no, I'm going to prove my innocence? I think this is one of those. This is going to be one of those bills that reverses the burden of proof. And if you're accused of misinformation by ACMA or by the minister, you're going to be guilty until you prove your innocence. Now, I think that's for this area, which is a really uncertain area, what counts as misinformation, none of us can agree on that. For this area, that's an extremely dangerous thing to do. I think it's even more dangerous than it looks on the surface. This is an undermining of our system.
Well, governments don't like to be criticised. And Sophie, I've got to say, your paper, your masthead, The Australian, has been doing some sensational reporting on this topic. So well done to you and your colleagues. But this letter that they've uncovered to show that Minister Rowland thinks that she is going to be able to go to ACMA, the industry watchdog, and dictate what things that they should put the scope on. That's not what we thought this was going to be. And there were already major concerns as it is.
Jack, there's a lot of concerns around the misinformation bill, and one of the aspects that has also made headlines that is a worry is that this does not apply to political parties. So very concerning. And you're right, Jack. Like, where does this start and end?
Your question is an absurd one.
And I think Australians should be very concerned that the government could have a firm grip
Your balls, got it?
on what they deem misinformation. And that is a worry. And I think this is a real threat to freedom of speech and a concern that all Australians should have. And I think this will play out next year as this continues to unfold. But what you were speaking about today is a real concern for all Australians, and one that we should be paying close attention to.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, they're just not clever enough to debate, are they, Sophie?
Your question is an absurd one.
So they just have to stop the debate from even happening.
That's my style. I hope you've noticed that.
That is what it is. So, yep.